the system established by the prior administration has failed too many students. Survivors, victims of a lack of due process, and campus administrators have all told me that the current approach does a disservice to everyone involved. That's why we must do better, because the current approach isn't working.
Education Secretary Betsy DeVos announced last week that she intends to rescind President Obama's 2011 guidelines for investigating sexual assault on college campuses, acknowledging that it's an issue we're not getting right. DeVos spent months meeting not only with assault survivors and college administrators, but also students who say they were wrongly accused and punished under the Obama administration's enforcement of Title IX, the federal law that covers such cases. Robert Shibley is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and author of the book, Twisting Title IX. So welcome. Good to have you here. Let's start, before we get to Secretary DeVos's new policy, what was wrong with the old system?
Well, the old system made a trade-off that we think didn't need to be made. It tried to trade the rights of people who are accused in order to try to create a system that it was felt would be more comfortable for victims and survivors to use and in order to come forward. Unfortunately, what it did was what everyone would have predicted who knows something about due process. When you reduce due process, when you reduce the protections for the accused, you start to get bad decisions and you start to get less careful versions of justice, and that's what we saw happen. All right, and just to be specific, the due process changes involved, let's be specific. One of them, I think, was changing the boundaries of evidence that you needed to find somebody guilty from beyond a reasonable doubt to the preponderance of evidence, which is a much lower standard. That's right. For the first time, the federal government said all schools who get federal funding, which is virtually all of them, public or private schools, have to use the preponderance of the evidence standard, which is a 50.01%, sort of 50% plus a feather standard of certainty. Schools before that had been free to use various standards. Another thing that they did was discourage the use of cross-examination. Yeah, so the accused would not have had the ability to cross-examine a witness necessarily, which is a fundamental right, obviously, of the defense in this country. Okay, so what do you think of Secretary DeVos's fix? Well, I think the Dear Colleague letter does indeed need to be rescinded. I think a consideration of due process is long overdue here. There's no reason that we can't both have due process, these procedural protections that you and I would expect if we went even to traffic court for these much more serious offenses on college campuses. There's no reason we can't do that and also serve the needs of victims and survivors. And she's also going to do it in a rulemaking, not just a letter. Initially, there'll be a letter, but ultimately it's going to be a formal rule. Unlike the administration before, which just issued this letter, which allows you to evade that public comment period of 90 days that we really have that ought to be attending new rules. That's right. One of the real problems with implementing the April 4th, 2011 Dear Colleague letter we're talking about is that it sort of was sprung on universities and certainly on civil liberties groups like us as a surprise. Nobody had any chance to comment on it. If we had, maybe things could have gone differently for the last 6.5 years. Well, this is one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because if you're a college administrator and you get that letter, I mean, I've heard from many of them, presidents and so on, who said, look, we had to go this direction and towards the preponderance of evidence standard to limiting due process, because if we didn't, there was an explicit threat that they would take away college funding. Now, are these administrators going to be free now to change that standard and restore a modicum of due process? That seems likely. The question will be whether or not they are going to go ahead and actually restore that due process. Obviously, they're still going to be under a lot of political pressure from folks who don't want those due process protections, but at least the government will have gotten out of the way. It's not a sufficient step, but it is a necessary step to restore due process on campus. What do you think? I mean, Joe Biden, the former vice president, he came out with a very tough statement saying that this is actually denial of rights
the denial of protection. We're not protecting women on campus, and this downgrades of protections for sexual assault. What's your response to that?
Well, we obviously disagree with the vice president. We think it's very important that victims of sexual assault have protections, but a Dear Colleague letter, which, as you said, didn't even go through notice and comment, certainly doesn't have the force of law, is not fundamental to the operation of Title IX. We can make sure that people don't suffer sex discrimination on campus, including sexual assault, without this rule by letter that Secretary DeVos, I think, very justifiably said is over.
One of the things that, other than Secretary Biden and some other, Vice President Biden and some of the other, few other comments, one of the things that I've been, I guess, cheered by this week is that there's been a relatively modest counter-reaction to this. It hasn't been as loud, vociferous, and critical as I might thought. And I wonder if you think, you look at the whole, the American university culture, is there some recognition even on the part of the left that this effort in the Obama administration just went too far and was unfair?
I think there is some recognition of that. These are very traditional values that are honestly not a partisan issue. People on both the left and the right think it's important, for instance, to have the presumption of innocence. FIRE put out a survey recently where we found out that out of the top 50 schools, nearly 75% of them don't presume students innocent when they're accused of things like this.
Right.
That's not a partisan issue. That's a popular issue.
All right. Thank you, Robert Shibley. Good to have you here.